Welcome back to Founding Chronicles, where we uncover the untold stories of America's past. Before we dive in, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from our channel. Today, we bring you the tragic tale of the Callahan Twins, locked away in a barn for 40 long years, hidden from the world because of fear, prejudice, and the cruelty of circumstance. Their story is a haunting glimpse into a forgotten chapter of American history, one that will stay with you long after the video ends. Let's begin. The Callahan farm sat on the edge of a sleepy Appalachian valley where mist curled around the trees each morning and the air carried the heavy scent of pine and damp earth. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, where the rhythms of nature dictated the pace of life more than clocks or calendars ever could. For the locals in the nearby town of Harper's Mill, the Callahan family was just another fixture of the countryside, stoic, distant, and a little peculiar. But behind the tall oak fence and the sagging roof of the farmhouse lay a secret that would later shock anyone who stumbled upon it, a secret that would grow heavier with each passing year, unspoken yet palpable to anyone who dared glance too closely. The Callahans had always been a hard-working family. John Callahan, the patriarch, was a man shaped by hardship and old-fashioned notions of duty. He was broad-shouldered, with calloused hands from decades of plowing fields, tending livestock, and raising his family under a sky that offered no shortcuts. His wife, Martha, was quieter, often lingering in the kitchen or the garden, her eyes cast downward as if she carried some invisible burden. Together they embodied the rigid, almost unyielding values of rural America in the early 20th century: discipline, order, and an unspoken insistence that appearances mattered above all else. It was in the cold spring of 1918 that the Callahans' world quietly shifted. Martha gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, both deformed in ways that the midwife hesitated even to describe. Their limbs were twisted, their faces uneven, their bodies fragile and delicate as porcelain dolls. In a time before modern medicine, before understanding of congenital disorders, their deformities were seen not as medical conditions but as shameful anomalies. The townspeople whispered when they learned of the children's birth, and even well-meaning relatives seemed to avert their eyes, as if the twins carried some invisible curse. John Callahan, in his grim practicality, believed that society could never accept what he now held in his arms. There were no doctors equipped to help, no community ready to embrace these children as part of ordinary life. And so, in a decision born of fear, despair, and perhaps misplaced protection, he built a small enclosure in the back of the barn. It was modest in size, but fortified with heavy wood and locks, a place designed to keep the children contained and hidden from the world. Martha, torn between love for her children and loyalty to her husband, followed silently, her protests muted. By exhaustion and fear, the twins, whom the Callahans named Samuel and Clara, were never given a proper cradle or nursery. Their existence became one of shadows and murmurs. From dawn until dusk, they were confined to the barn, surrounded by hay, rickety furniture, and the echoing emptiness of abandonment. John visited them once in a while, often bringing food or basic necessities, while Martha tried to soothe them with soft words and gentle hands. The twins' eyes, bright and curious despite their circumstances, would follow their parents with a mixture of longing and confusion. They could hear the laughter of children from the town, the distant ringing of church bells, the ordinary life they were barred from ever knowing. In those early years, the world outside the barn continued to turn. Harper's Mill carried on with its slow, predictable rhythm. Children ran through the fields, tending to chores and school, unaware of the tiny lives hidden just beyond their reach. The Callahans attended church on Sundays, greeting neighbors. With polite nods and yet behind closed doors, the twins remained invisible. No one asked, and no one questioned, not because the community lacked curiosity, but because people were willing to accept the surface of things and avoid the uncomfortable truths that hid beneath. Inside the barn, time had a different texture. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into years. Samuel and Clara grew slowly, their bodies fragile and bent, their movements awkward but determined. They learned the rhythms of the farm from the barn itself, the sound of the wind through the slats, the faint scurry of mice, the distant lowing of cattle. Their parents spoke to them rarely, and when they did, it was often in tones of caution or warning. "Stay in your corner," John would say, his voice rough as gravel. "Do not wander. Do not ask for things you cannot have." And the twins, obedient yet yearning, obeyed. Loneliness became a constant companion. Samuel and Clara learned to speak to each other in whispers, creating a private world of shared imagination. They invented stories about the people they glimpsed. From the barn windows, about the life they might have had if the world had been kinder. Sometimes they pressed their faces against the cracks in the wood, watching harvesters in the fields or children playing by the river, dreaming of a freedom that would always remain just out of reach. By the time the twins were 10, their bodies had grown more noticeably, and their deformities became harder to conceal. Martha wept silently when she saw the strain on their small frames. John, on the other hand, grew stricter, convinced that any exposure to the outside world would bring shame or ridicule. He reinforced the barn, added locks, and installed heavier latches. The twins' lives became a cycle of routine: eat, sleep, whisper to each other, and survive in a world where they existed only in secret. Even in such darkness, there were moments of fragile joy. Martha would sometimes sneak small gifts, a ribbon, a carved wooden animal, a simple song hummed into the cold air. Samuel and Clara clung to these moments like sunlight, their hearts storing warmth in a place where human contact was scarce. They developed a remarkable resilience, their spirits unbroken even as the years stretched on, a testament to the strength of human hope amid crushing neglect. The story of the Callahan twins is not merely one of cruelty. It is also one of isolation, fear, and the consequences of societal prejudice. It is a reflection of a time when deformity was met with shame rather than compassion, when the rural American heart often feared the unfamiliar. And it is a story that, as decades would pass, would leave scars not only on those who lived it, but on the very land that bore witness to 40 years of silence, suffering, and secrecy. The years moved on, but for Samuel and Clara, the barn remained their entire universe. They grew taller, though their bodies remained twisted and fragile, each step measured and careful. Their skin, pale from lack of sunlight, seemed to shimmer slightly in the thin rays that slipped through the wooden slats, a reminder of the outside world they could never fully touch. The twins had begun to understand, with a sharp and painful clarity, that the barn was not merely a shelter, it was a cage. Yet it was the only world they had ever known, and in its dim corners, they found ways to adapt, to survive, and even to find small pockets of beauty in the ordinary. Martha remained their sole source of human tenderness. Each morning, she would open the barn doors just enough to let in the scent of hay and fresh air. She would kneel beside them, brushing their hair, murmuring quiet reassurances that the world outside would never understand, but that she loved them all the same. Sometimes she would hum soft hymns, the notes floating into the rafters and mingling with the sounds of the farm, the lowing of cattle, the creaking of the windmill, the distant barking of dogs. For a brief moment, the twins would forget their confinement and imagine a life in which laughter was not tinged with sorrow, in which hands reached for them, not with pity but with genuine warmth. John, however, became increasingly rigid with each passing year. The town of Harper's Mill remained unaware of the twins' existence, and John intended to keep it that way. Occasionally, travelers would pass by the farm, curious about the large barn and the overgrown orchard, but John's stern presence and curt responses ensured that questions remained unasked. He believed that to reveal the twins would invite judgment, ridicule, and perhaps even legal intervention. So the twins remained hidden, their lives marked by routine, quiet desperation, and the faint, persistent ache of being unseen. Despite the oppressive solitude, Samuel and Clara learned to observe the world beyond their confinement with extraordinary acuity. They became attuned to the subtle changes in the weather, the rhythm of the seasons, the way light shifted through the barn at different times of day. They memorized the routines of the farmhands, predicting when John or Martha might enter, when the animals would be fed, and when the faintest opportunity might arise for a fleeting escape into sunlight. These observations became a kind of intellectual exercise, a lifeline that helped them maintain some sense of agency in a life otherwise dictated by others. Loneliness, however, was a relentless companion. At night, when the barn grew cold and shadows thickened like curtains around them, Samuel and Clara would huddle together, whispering stories of a world they might never see. They imagined streets lined with laughter, markets bustling with life, and children running freely in fields not bounded by fences. They spoke of schools where learning was a joy rather than a forbidden dream, and of neighbors who would accept them without question. Their imagination became a sanctuary, a private rebellion against the cruel limitations imposed upon them. Martha, sensing the growing awareness in her children, sometimes risked small acts of defiance against her husband's strict rules. She would bring them scraps of books or newspapers, the pages filled with pictures of far-off cities, trains, and people dressed in fashions that seemed magical to the twins. These glimpses into the outside world ignited a yearning that could not be contained, a mix of hope and sorrow that deepened with each passing year. Samuel and Clara would pore over the images, inventing stories for each person, speculating on the lives of strangers who moved in a world of freedom while they remained trapped. As the twins entered adolescence, the strain of their confinement became increasingly evident. Their bodies, though resilient in some ways, were unable to grow without difficulty. Their legs ached from the constant strain, their backs bowed unnaturally, and their hands, once delicate, became calloused from the rough surfaces of the barn. Yet even as their physical limitations became more pronounced, their minds continued to expand. They became fiercely intelligent, absorbing knowledge from the scraps of text Martha provided and from the conversations they overheard through the cracks in the barn walls. Their resilience was remarkable, but it was tinged with a profound sadness born of the isolation that defined their existence. Outside the barn, the world marched on. The 1920s brought radio broadcasts and the distant hum of automobiles through Harper's Mill. Newspapers carried headlines of national events, wars abroad, and political upheaval, all of which seemed to exist in a parallel universe, inaccessible to the twins. They could hear the excitement in the town, the discussions of neighbors who spoke of progress, innovation, and opportunity. But these things were nothing more than distant echoes. For Samuel and Clara, the passage of time was measured not in the events of the world, but in the subtle changes within their prison, the slow decay of wooden beams, the shift in light across the floor, and the quiet, ever-present rhythm of life, denied to them. By the time Samuel and Clara were in their late teens, they had developed an extraordinary bond with one another. Their dependence on each other was absolute, a deep and unbreakable connection forged through shared suffering and whispered dreams. They could communicate with a glance, a touch, or a subtle shift in posture. Each had become the other's anchor in a life that offered no other support. And yet beneath the strength of this bond, there was an undercurrent of yearning, a silent plea for the world beyond the barn, for the sunlight and laughter that had been denied to them since birth. John's behavior, however, was becoming more severe. He viewed the twins' growing curiosity as dangerous, a potential threat to the careful equilibrium he had maintained for decades. He began to restrict even the small privileges Martha had managed to provide. Books were removed, windows closed off more securely, and any signs of imagination or independent thought were met with stern warnings. The twins, sensing the mounting tension, retreated further into themselves, their inner world of stories and dreams becoming both sanctuary and prison. Yet, in the darkness of their confinement, Samuel and Clara began to cultivate a quiet form of rebellion. They found ways to preserve their sense of self despite the oppressive environment. They memorized snippets of poetry from the pages Martha had smuggled in, recited stories to one another in the dead of night, and created intricate maps of the farm in their minds, plotting secret routes and imagining escapes that may never come. These small acts of mental freedom became essential to their survival, sustaining them as they approached adulthood without ever knowing the touch of a friend or the warmth of the sun on their skin. The barn, once a refuge of necessity, had become a labyrinth of memory, pain, and longing. Each beam, each shadowed corner, held a fragment of their lives. Laughter and sorrow, hope and despair intertwined. 40 years of silence had yet to come, but the foundations were already being laid. Samuel and Clara were growing into adults, shaped entirely by confinement, their minds sharp, their spirits resilient, yet forever tethered to the shadows of the barn. As the years pressed forward, the twins' world remained largely unchanged, yet subtle cracks began to appear in the rigid order John Callahan had imposed. By the late 1930s, Samuel and Clara were in their 30s, adults in body and mind, yet still prisoners in a world defined entirely by the barn's walls. Their deformities had worsened with age, bending bones and straining muscles, but their resilience had only grown stronger. They moved with deliberate care through the narrow paths between stacks of hay, and the silence of their environment became a constant companion, sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating. Martha, now in her 50s, had grown weary from decades of living with the burden of the secret. Her hair had turned gray, her hands more fragile, yet she still approached the barn each day, carrying food and whispered words of comfort. Occasionally, her eyes betrayed her longing for freedom, not for herself, but for the children she loved as though they were extensions of her own heart. She had become a silent witness to their suffering, a participant in a life she had never imagined. Each glance toward them carried guilt, fear, and an unspoken apology for the choices that had imprisoned them. Yet she continued to serve as their sole human connection beyond the distant, gruff figure of John. John, hardened by decades of fear and an unwavering need to control, had become increasingly isolated himself. Friends and neighbors, once curious about the Callahan farm, had drifted away, leaving him and his family secluded. His obsession with hiding the twins had grown into a kind of paranoia. He fortified the barn further, installed locks and barriers that made escape nearly impossible, and monitored every sound and movement with vigilance. The twins' cries, once plaintive and timid, were now met with stern commands and threats, reinforcing a cycle of silence and submission. The twins, however, had developed extraordinary ingenuity in response to their confinement. Their minds, honed by years of solitude and observation, became their most valuable tool. They began to notice patterns in John's routines, predict when Martha would deliver small comforts, and memorize every inch of the barn with meticulous detail. They found ways to fashion rudimentary tools from scrap wood, string, and metal, crafting a private universe of small achievements that gave them a sense of agency in an otherwise powerless existence. These acts, while modest, became a form of quiet rebellion, a statement that, despite the years of oppression, they could not be completely broken. Though physically weak, Their emotional and intellectual lives thrived. They shared thoughts and ideas that extended far beyond the barn walls. Samuel and Clara developed a rich internal culture, elaborate stories, imagined worlds, and complex games that occupied their minds for hours. They spoke of cities they had never visited, people they had never met, and dreams they could never act upon. In these shared imaginings, they discovered a fragile kind of freedom, one that neither John's rules nor the world's ignorance could ever take away. The isolation, however, began to take a heavier toll on Martha. She grew increasingly haunted by the moral weight of her complicity. Nights were sleepless, her conscience burdened by the knowledge that the twins' entire lives had been stolen. She feared that the consequences of John's decisions would ripple outward, leaving scars not only on the children, but also on herself. Yet confronting him was impossible. His temper had hardened over the decades, and any attempt to challenge his authority could have led to punishment or worse. Her love for the twins forced her to remain quiet, a silent guardian trapped within a moral cage of her own making. Samuel and Clara's emotional resilience, while impressive, could not shield them entirely from the realities of their condition. As they aged, their bodies became more fragile, their movements more constrained. Tasks that once required effort now became monumental challenges. Their muscles stiffened, bones cracked, and joints ached with each motion. Yet, even in the face of these hardships, they clung to each other, a constant and unbreakable bond that provided solace amid the relentless oppression. The barn, while a prison, had also become a sanctuary, a space in which they could be together without judgment, where their minds and hearts could remain unbroken. The outside world, meanwhile, was changing. The 1940s brought new technology, new social norms, and a gradual shift in how disability and deformity were perceived. Radio broadcasts and newspapers carried stories of faraway events, wars overseas, and innovations in medicine that promised better lives for many. The twins, cut off from these developments, could only imagine these transformations, wondering if the world beyond the barn had become kinder, more accepting, more capable of seeing them as human beings rather than curiosities. Their longing intensified, yet it was tempered by the cruel reality that their lives had been confined for decades, and escape seemed ever more impossible with each passing year. John's behavior grew even more severe during these decades. His fear of exposure and shame transformed into a kind of obsession. Any noise from the barn, any sound that might hint at life beyond, was met with suspicion and harsh reprimands. He installed more locks, reinforced the barn walls, and monitored every movement of the twins with an almost clinical precision. Martha, powerless to counter him, continued to care for the twins quietly, knowing that her own survival and theirs depended on discretion. The twins, though trapped, had learned to move with silence, to anticipate John's moods, and to avoid confrontation whenever possible. Yet, in the darkest corners of their confinement, the twins' humanity persisted. They formed routines that gave structure to their days, celebrating small victories and marking the passage of time with rituals only they understood. Samuel would trace patterns in the dust with his fingers, while Clara would hum songs she remembered from fleeting moments in childhood. These practices, though simple, became acts of resistance, assertions of identity and life in a world that sought to deny both. In their moments of despair, they often whispered of freedom, of what it might feel like to step outside and breathe in the air unfiltered by wood and shadow. These discussions were brief and cautious, for fear of anger or punishment, yet they were necessary for survival. They reminded each other that their spirits were not entirely captive, even if their bodies were. The barn could hold their bodies, but their minds remained elusive, a realm John could never dominate. The decades stretched on, and the twins' isolation became nearly absolute. Time itself seemed to warp inside the barn. Days and nights lost their distinctiveness, and the twins' memories of the outside world blurred with dreams and imagination. Yet, even in this distorted time, life persisted. The human spirit, it seemed, was capable of sustaining hope, even in the bleakest of circumstances. Samuel and Clara had learned to survive not just physically, but emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually, creating a rich inner world that no lock or wall could ever fully contain. And still, the shadow of the barn loomed over every aspect of their existence. 40 years would pass, and with each year, the twins' lives would be further shaped by confinement, love, fear, and the fragile threads of hope that connected them to each other and to the mother who quietly nurtured them. The stage was set for the final decades of their ordeal, a period that would test the limits of human endurance, the complexities of familial loyalty, and the haunting consequences of a society that preferred ignorance to compassion. By the 1950s, Samuel and Clara were well into middle age, yet their lives remained defined entirely by the walls of the barn. 40 years had passed since their confinement began, and the twins were now fully adults in mind, but still prisoners in body. Their faces, once pale from youth, had grown lined with the passage of time, and their bodies, bent and frail, bore the marks of decades of physical strain. Yet the spark in their eyes, the quiet brilliance of curiosity and defiance, remained intact, a stubborn testament to human resilience in the face of relentless oppression. Martha, older and more fragile than ever, continued to care for them, though each day was increasingly difficult. Her hands trembled as she carried meals, her back ached from the constant bending and lifting, yet she persisted. She had grown into the role of protector and confessor, the only bridge between the twins and the outside world. Her whispered words of comfort, her songs hummed softly into the barn rafters, and her small acts of kindness had become lifelines for Samuel and Clara, sustaining them in a world that had long since abandoned them. John, now in the twilight of his life, had become a figure of rigid obsession. The barn, once simply a measure of protection, had become a fortress, each lock and reinforcement a symbol of decades-long fear and control. Yet even he could not entirely suppress the humanity of the twins, though he rarely acknowledged it. There were fleeting moments, a glance, a word, that betrayed the complex emotions he felt. Love, fear, shame, and guilt intertwined in ways he could neither untangle nor express. But these moments were fleeting, often drowned out by decades of habitual cruelty and the unyielding desire to shield his family from the judgment of others. Inside the barn, Samuel and Clara had built a life that was both extraordinary and tragic. They had cultivated an inner world rich with imagination, knowledge, and subtle rebellion. They had memorized stories, created maps of the farm, and developed rituals that brought structure and meaning to the monotony of confinement. They had witnessed the seasons change, learned to read the signs of weather, and developed an almost supernatural awareness of the rhythms of life beyond the walls. Yet, all of this was overshadowed by the profound isolation that defined their existence. They were human beings who had lived decades without meaningful contact, without the simple joy of touch or conversation with anyone outside their immediate family. As the twins grew older, their longing for the outside world intensified. They dreamed not just of freedom, but of recognition, of being seen as human beings rather than curiosities or burdens. They imagined walking through fields, feeling the sun on their faces, hearing the laughter of children, and experiencing life in a way that had been denied to them since birth. These dreams became both a source of hope and a source of agony, for they were painfully aware that decades of confinement had left them unprepared for the world beyond the barn. The community of Harper's Mill remained largely ignorant of the twins' existence, though whispers and rumors began to surface as decades passed. Some spoke of strange noises from the Callahan farm, of glimpses of shadowy figures in the barn, or of the odd behavior of John and Martha. Yet curiosity was tempered by fear and respect for the family's stern reputation. No one investigated closely, and the twins remained hidden, their lives a secret that stretched into the shadows of history. Inevitably, time took its toll on John. He grew older, frailer, and less capable of maintaining the rigid control he had enforced for so many years. His death, when it came, was sudden, but not entirely unexpected. A collapse of the body he had worn down through decades of labor and obsession. With him gone, the balance of power on the farm shifted subtly but irrevocably. Martha, now alone, had to confront the reality of her own choices and the weight of decades of secrecy. She faced a moral reckoning. The twins had lived 40 years in the shadows, and their future depended entirely on her courage and compassion. For Samuel and Clara, the death of their father marked a turning point. Though physically weak and worn, they experienced a cautious sense of liberation. Martha, recognizing that the twins had survived against incredible odds, began to take steps to ease their confinement. Windows were opened wider, doors unlocked, and the first tentative steps toward integration with the outside world began. The twins, unused to freedom, approached it with a mixture of fear, hope, and uncertainty. Every sensation, the warmth of sunlight, the sound of wind through trees, the distant laughter of townspeople, was overwhelming, yet exhilarating. The reintegration was not without challenges. Decades of isolation had left Samuel and Clara with limited social experience, physical weakness, and deep psychological scars. They had to relearn basic skills, confront their fears of judgment and ridicule, and slowly acclimate to the realities of a world that had changed dramatically since their confinement began. Yet with Martha's support and their own remarkable resilience, they began to navigate these challenges. Small steps, walking in the orchard, visiting the edge of the village, interacting with curious neighbors, became monumental achievements, milestones marking their emergence from 40 years of shadows. The wider world, once unaware of the twins, slowly became informed of their story. The tale of the Callahan twins, hidden away for decades due to deformity and fear, stirred shock, empathy, and deep reflection among those who learned of it. Newspapers chronicled their ordeal, historians documented the story, and the community of Harper's Mill grappled with the moral and social implications. The narrative became a powerful lesson about the consequences of fear, prejudice, and secrecy, and a testament to the human spirit's capacity for endurance and resilience even under the most harrowing circumstances. Ultimately, Samuel and Clara's lives became a symbol of survival against unimaginable odds. Their confinement, lasting 40 years, was a grim reflection of societal failures, of how difference and deformity were often met with shame rather than understanding. Yet their emergence into the world, fragile but alive, demonstrated the enduring strength of human hope and the capacity for love, perseverance, and adaptation. The barn, once a prison, became a relic of history, a reminder of what had been endured, and a monument to the resilience of two extraordinary individuals who had survived against the weight of decades of neglect and fear. In the quiet twilight of their lives, the twins could finally walk beneath the sky, breathe deeply of the air that had been denied to them for so long, and hear the distant laughter and music of the world they had imagined for decades. Their bond, forged in suffering and sustained by shared hope, remained unbreakable, a source of comfort and strength. And though the shadow of their past would never fully vanish, the light of freedom, however delayed, allowed them to reclaim a fragment of the lives that had been stolen from them. The story of the Callahan twins remains etched into history as a haunting reminder of human cruelty, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. It challenges us to confront our own assumptions, to extend compassion where fear might otherwise prevail, and to recognize that even in the darkest corners of human experience, hope can survive, sometimes against impossible odds, and shine with an extraordinary brilliance that no wall, lock, or shadow can extinguish.